Good evening, everyone. It is quite splendid to see so many of you here this evening. And I think what serendipity that the John Cain Foundation is holding this event within a week of Labor's victory here in Victoria. I think we can say Gough would be pleased and would no doubt see his own hand at work. I think it's fair to say that Gough Whitlam's intervention in Victoria over 4 decades ago, as controversial as it was, is now seen, certainly among our guests tonight, as a critical turning point in the fortunes of Labor in Victoria. It's fitting as well, I think, that we gather this evening to hear different perspectives on the legacy of Gough Whitlam, as many of us did in the Sydney Town Hall just over a month ago. Now, there were many fine tributes that day, from Tony Whitlam, from John Faulkner, from Noel Pearson, of course, many memorable phrases as well from, among others, Graham Freudenberg. And certainly his conclusion is something that I won't forget in a hurry. He said that Gough Whitlam was a man you'd go to the barricades with. Of course, Gough would point to the error there, a sentence that ends with the preposition, horror of horrors. Tonight we will hear from people who worked with Gough, from those who moved within his orbit, and those whose own careers were inspired by him. All of them, I think we can say, came to see the world and certainly the possibilities for Australia and its place in that world a little differently as a result of that experience. We'll hear in turn from Barry Jones, from Race Matthews, from Iola Matthews, and from John Cain. So would you please welcome our first speaker this evening, Barry Jones.
Maxine and friends, Gough Whitlam, who transformed Australian politics and in unprecedented ways, and in a relatively short time as Prime Minister, just 2 years, 11 months and 7 days, that he would say, was a major change agent. He died at Lulworth House in Sydney on the 21st of October 2014 at the age of 98 years, 3 months and 10 days. It was long expected, of course, but when he died, I felt orphaned, and that sense of national grieving was perhaps more intense and lasted longer than I would even have imagined. As you all know, he was born in Kew in July 1916. Coincidentally, so is Dick Hamer, and as Gough used to say, same place, same month, same year, different fathers. I met Gough Whitlam first in Canberra in September 1954, and we maintained a friendship, if that's not too pretentious a word, for the next 60 years. I saw him every time that I was in Sydney. He telephoned me in June, and I spoke to him for the last time on his birthday on the 11th of July. He failed in one of his ambitions to be the oldest living person to have headed a government anywhere. However, he was the longest-lived head of government in the English-speaking world, longer than any United States president, British monarch or Prime Minister of Britain, Canada as we say these days, Australia, Ireland or New Zealand. But internationally, he only came in third after 2 household names, Telmo Vargas, the former president of Ecuador, and Pete de Jong, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. And every time I saw him, he always asked, how am I on the list? Am I first yet? He ranked number 15 in his length of service as Australian Prime Minister. But number 1 on the list, Sir Robert Menzies, served more than 6 times as long. But I think if you look at Whitlam's achievement, I think Whitlam's achievement is more significant, more substantial, more contemporary, more relevant, more long-lasting than that long Menzian period. If you reflect, although Menzies' gift as a great orator, a strategist, a campaigner, parliamentarian, he had these spectacular misjudgments on so many issues. He was wrong on Hitler, wrong on Munich, wrong on appeasement generally, wrong on the end of empire, wrong on Indian independence, Indonesian independence, the Chinese Revolution, Suez, apartheid in South Africa, Britain and the common market, and the war in Vietnam. But even before he died in 1978, he recognised himself that the issues that he'd been identified with had become completely anachronistic. Gough was very uncomfortable with the current definition of man as Homo economicus, and he had a passionate commitment to the whole idea of the abundant life. He was committed to the concept of information as a precondition to action. He had a passion for information and education, assuming that if only the facts are revealed, prejudice, ignorance, and sectional interest would fall away. It didn't always happen. As the late Clem Lloyd wrote, his central characteristic was a remorseless didacticism. The Hansard Index records Gough Whitlam's astounding industry. He spoke more and asked or answered more questions, with or without notice, on a far wider range of subjects than any member in the history of the House of Representatives. Working on an average of 72 years in each column of the index, in the 10 years between 1969 and 1978, Whitlam made 11,360 contributions. The highest number was in 1971, 2412 entries, the lowest in 1978, the year he resigned. The numbers fell in the years of his prime ministership because he was limited to answering questions and unable to ask them, which must have been frustrating. And when he left the Parliament, he was kind enough to provide me with questions on notice, which I could put in and have answered on his behalf, but under my name, not his. I think, contrary to the widely held view, Whitlam did understand the fundamentals of economics in a rather broad way, and the implications of globalisation for Australia, even though it was not his topic of choice. John Hyde's book, Dry, 2003, identifies only 2 Labor MPs who indicated some understanding of and sympathy for Bert Kelly's long campaign against tariffs. Gough Whitlam was one, Reg Pollard the other. The magnum opus, the Whitlam government, contains 20 chapters, 1 overview and 19 on specific policy areas. The chapter on the economy is comprehensive, well-written and well-argued, an effective rebuttal of the conventional wisdom that Whitlam was an economic agnostic. The book's range is impressive, with chapters on Aborigines, migrants, women, arts, letters and media. Indeed, the only significant omissions are science and technology and sport. He had no feeling for science at all, and there was a punitive element in the demotion of Clyde Cameron from being Minister for Labour to being Minister for Science. He told me once he did not propose to read Sleeper's Wake. Far too erudite for me, comrade. Gough Whitlam had an exceptional range of interests, including the classics, heritage and environment. I followed him as Australia's representative to UNESCO and to the World Heritage Committee. He went off to Harvard, I went off to Cambridge, but we travelled together on some memorable visits. If I had to choose his greatest single achievement, it would be that he took the demonology out of foreign policy and replaced it with rational, strategic analysis. In the long Menzies era, there was an obsessive preoccupation with the Cold War, communism and Asian nationalism, with the last two often being conflated. And this was based on these premises, that the Soviet Union was incredibly powerful and a mortal threat to Australia. That Britain and the United States, generally the latter, knew how to safeguard Australia's interests better than we did. That China was the driving force behind the wars in Korea and Vietnam. That if Vietnam was unified under communist rule, this would create a domino effect which would lead to the fall of Thailand, Burma, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and ultimately Australia. That Egypt's seizure of the Suez Canal was another major threat to Australia's survival. Television advertisements during election campaigns, which many of you will remember, showed arrows from Asia sweeping down to Australia. It was all deeply mad. Whitlam's visit to the People's Republic of China to meet Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai before the Nixon delegation was epoch-changing. He returned to China as Prime Minister as well. He was the first Australian Prime Minister to visit the Soviet Union, as it then was, in January 1975, although he failed in his primary objective of finding out what had happened to the Grand Duchess Anastasia. In the great Its Time policy speech from 1972, Whitlam set out three great aims: to promote equality, to involve the people of Australia in the decision-making process of our land, and to liberate the talents and uplift the horizons of the Australian people. He invoked the touchstone of modern democracy: liberty, equality, fraternity. The specific pledges in the program included a new charter for the children of Australia, involving the creative energies of our youth in a creative, concerned community. The real answer to the modern malaise of juvenile crime, drugs and vandalism. Preschool for every children, major Commonwealth spending on schools and teachers, free tertiary education, raising basic pensions to 25% of average weekly earnings, a universal health insurance scheme, national compensation scheme, rebuilding existing cities and building new ones, tackling land and housing costs, giving local government full access to the Loan Council and Grant Commission, intervention in prices and consumer protection, an expanded Australian Industry Development Corporation, abolishing conscription, Aboriginal land rights and independence to Papua New Guinea. I mention that long list because you'll be struck that a significant number of the promises are in fact economic. Surprisingly, some causes he'd campaigned for long and vigorously: recognition of China, constitutional reform, expansion of development of the arts, especially film, and a massive, the word would have been characteristic, massive extension of sewerage services to the outer suburbs of our major cities, were not listed. Not one pledge, of course, it has to be said, referred to revenue generation, wealth creation, or the nation's economic base, nor was there any reference to science or technology. One would not have guessed from reading the 1972 policy speech that Australia was on the brink of a technological revolution, for which it was singularly ill prepared. Clem Lloyd's point about Whitlam's remorseless didacticism deserves elaboration. Whitlam liked to speak at length and on the subjects that engaged him: ratification of ILO conventions, uniform railway gauges, UNESCO's World Heritage System, altering a Commonwealth constitution. He gave long, lucid speeches incorporating the odd witticism, but devoted to explaining. Sometimes he went on too long and audiences could sometimes be fatigued, but he never shortchanged them or talked down to them. James Walker in Tunnel Vision pointed out that political debate depends on having alternative points of view, so that if the government says that our economic future depends on growth, by which they mean consumption, including junk food and gambling, while investment in research, in environmental protection or heritage is seen as negative terms as a cost, you might think that this is something that you could debate about. But often oppositions are eager to assert that it's just as keen on going for growth as well. And so the result is the opportunity to have a serious managed debate in that area simply disappears. Jim Walter says, where debate is superseded by monistic conviction, we are told that there are no options. That's in effect a veto on politics. Politics was driven off the agenda. There was only one idea, that Australians must respond to the dictates of the international market. It was a time of prescription to, rather than dialogue with, the community. Much of the Whitlam platform, much more than generally recognised, survived under the Whitlam years. survived during the Fraser years. Very striking to remember that when the great changes in foreign policy, for example, were maintained by Malcolm Fraser, then maintained, of course, by Hawke and Keating, so that you had a period of 24 years of continuity on foreign policy. And then, after that, with the Howard years, you had a reversion to the idea of demonology out there, especially in the Middle East. Then back on track under Gillard Rudd, and now we've got demonology back in force. Gough Whitlam was a great enlarger, a man of huge vision and capacity, and we were all enriched, even if sometimes exasperated, by his life and work. And we think of this especially at a time when we are distinctly light on vision, and as Danton would have said, audacity, audacity, audacity.
Barry, thank you so much for that splendid opening. And I must say, to your point about Gough's economic achievements, it was interesting to note the business journalist Alan Kohler, who said after Gough's passing that he felt that, in fact, the opening up to China was his greatest economic achievement, as we have been living off the benefits ever since.